Hi, this is Helen Thomas again, and I am going to try to attempt to explain the federal budget process by utilizing this slide before you. And it is covered in CDFM Module 2.1. Now, understand that the budget basis of development is based on getting the warfighter, those that are in the actual combat zone, what they are required to have, what resources they're required to have. So the first thing you must understand is that operational chain of command runs from the president to the Secretary of Defense directly to the combatant commands. Now you understand your president is a civilian, your Secretary of Defense is a civilian, and then you have your combatant commanders who are your military members. So at the level where the president and SecDef are, they have to have military advisors. And so we're going to look at who those advisors are. The next thing you want to understand is that everything starts off with the national security strategy. So first thing, the National Security Council is made up of the president, the vice president, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Secretary of Energy and Water. And then you have two advisors, the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff and the Director of Intelligence. So the top military advisor is the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. He's in uniform. And then your director, your CIA folks, is your Director of Intelligence. So the National Security Council develops a national security strategy document, which is called the National Security Strategy. It's like any other operation order, op order. So when you get this National Security Strategy op order at the DoD level, then the Department of Defense utilizes 3 decision support systems based on the National Security Strategy document. So DoD takes the big op order and now has to develop that national defense strategy. And they use 3 systems to do that. JCIDS, Joint Capability Integration Development System, PPBE, Planning, Programming, Budgeting, and Execution, and the Defense Acquisition System. So the keys to understand is all 3 of these systems consistently overlaps with one another. So this diagram would not directly depict that, but you need to remember all these processes are in continuously going. So the first system is, so once DoD determines what the defense strategy needs to be, that's your civilian. So now your chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff and the other Joint Chiefs of Staff need to determine what the military capabilities are, and they need to identify any capability gaps. So that system that is used to identify capability gaps is the Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System. That is your JCIDS. The systematic method used by the Joint Chief of Staff to assess gaps in military warfighting capability. So now knowing what the defense strategy is, the military has to determine what the military strategy is going to be and identify if there are any capability gaps that will stop us from meeting that capability that is necessary to fill that gap. So the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, which you see right here, will provide the SecDef an assessment of the gaps and then the solution. Don't just bring the problem, you need to bring a solution to fill the gap. You notice under the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, he has a vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So the executor of this JCID system is the vice chairman. The chairman, not going to do the work himself. He's got to vice chairman. So the vice chairman is the executor of JCIDS, and he also sits on a Joint Requirements Oversight Council board, which is listed here, which analyzes the gaps and provides recommendation to the Undersecretary of Defense, ATNL, and the Defense Acquisition Board. So if the result of JCIDS, once they analyze the .MLPF, the doctrine, and when you go back to that organization training, if the solution to fill this gap is a material solution, it will then trigger the acquisition system. So the vice chairman, he is the executor of JCIDS, and he's the chairman of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, and he's the vice chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board with this USD. So that's why he's providing recommendation. So the purpose of the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is to make sure that all three of these systems stay in line with what the defense strategy needs to be to meet this national security strategy. So if we need funding, then we have to initiate the planning, programming, budgeting, and execution system. This is the system that is used to resource and fill that capability gap. So your key players, those combatant commanders we talked about, and although the operational chain of command runs from the president, the SecDef, to the combatant commanders, the majority of the communication from the president, the National Security Council, or the SecDef goes through your top military advisor, which is the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So to begin the P process, your combatant commanders will determine what their capability gaps are, what issues they have. So again, these combatant commanders in North Com, South Com, and so forth, AFRICOM. So these are the individuals who are responsible for a large overarching area of the map, and they would then submit an IPL, Integrated Priority List, to the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, your Secretary of Defense, your Deputy Secretary of Defense, and military departments. This is like a heads up to these areas, or the military department, because all the resources are in one of those military departments. So depending on what the capability needed, your combatant commanders who submit the IPLs up to the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. The chairman will then do his assessment and recommendation of how to fill that IPL requirement. The chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff will write. He is the author of the National Military Strategy. So your top military advisor is the author of your National Military Strategy. He submits his assessment and recommendation to the Secretary of Defense. The Secretary of Defense will then take the information submitted from the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, the combatant commanders, and he will develop his quadrennial report, strategic guidance, homeland defense, and civil support. How are we going to defend our homeland? How are we going to defend overseas? And our strategic focus for the next 4 years listed in the quadrennial review. The next phase. So now in the planning phase, taking all of that policy guidance we receive from the SecDef, we begin the planning phase. The individual responsible for the planning phase at the DoD level is the USD for policy. Undersecretary of Defense for Policy is responsible for the planning phase of the PPBE process. The planning phase is where you develop the plan to meet that national security strategy. The DoD, once its plan is complete, will issue a defense planning guidance, or you may see it called the Defense Planning and Programming Guidance, DPPG. Because some individual has said recently on their test, it did not list the DPG, it lists the DPPG, which was in the 2011 study guide. So Defense Planning Guidance or Defense Planning and Programming Guidance. Before we start any process, we receive guidance from higher. That DPPG is sent to the agencies. At the same time, at the end of the planning phase, the individual responsible